The luxury aircraft showroom was a place of precision and perfection, where even the air carried the scent of exclusivity. Gleaming jets stood proudly on display, their polished exteriors reflecting the pristine surroundings. This was not a place for ordinary customers. It was a sanctuary for billionaires, a domain where only the world's elite dared to step in and make purchases worth hundreds of millions. Through the automatic doors, a man entered calm, unassuming, and completely out of place. He wore a faded gray t-shirt, an old cap pulled low over his face, and jeans that had seen better days. His sneakers, worn at the soles, barely made a sound against the marble floor. The moment he stepped inside, he attracted attention, but not in the way most visitors did. Behind the main counter, a sharply dressed employee named Richard noticed the newcomer and immediately frowned. He was a tall, blond man in his mid-30s, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than the average person's yearly salary. His trained eye had developed an instinct for spotting potential buyers. And this man? He wasn't one of them. Richard shot a glance at security, who was stationed in the corner, ready to intervene if necessary. The guard, a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, simply waited, arms crossed, assessing the situation. There was no need to act yet. Straightening his tie, Richard walked over with an air of superiority, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor. His expression was neutral, but his body language screamed condescension. "Sir," he said, his voice laced with false politeness. "Can I help you?" The man, whose features remained partially hidden beneath his cap, glanced around with an air of quiet admiration. His eyes traced the sleek designs of the aircraft, appreciating every curve, every perfect detail. "Yes," he said simply, turning to Richard with an easy smile. "I'd like to see some models." Richard's lips twitched, barely suppressing a smirk. "Models?" he repeated, as if the very idea was preposterous. He crossed his arms and tilted his head slightly. The customer didn't flinch. "Yes, I'd like to take a look at the aircraft." Richard exhaled through his nose, his patience wearing thin. "Sir, these are not just regular planes," he said, choosing his words carefully. "They are the most exclusive private jets in the world. We cater to a very particular clientele." "I understand," the man replied, unfazed. "I'd still like to see them." Richard barely concealed his amusement. He had seen all types of dreamers walk through those doors, be people who wanted to touch luxury for a brief moment before walking out, empty wallets in hand. This man was clearly another one of them. "Very well," Richard said with a forced smile, gesturing toward the showroom. "If you insist." He turned on his heel, walking briskly toward the VIP section, expecting the man to hesitate or back out. Instead, the stranger followed without a second thought, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. The two disappeared down the sleek, minimalist hallway leading to the showroom's most exclusive displays. Meanwhile, other employees exchanged knowing looks, some whispering among themselves. "Another one?" one of them muttered. "He won't last 5 minutes," another scoffed. But as Richard led the man deeper into the showroom, a subtle shift in the air hinted that this encounter was about to take an unexpected turn. The VIP showroom was a world within a world of private section, designed for those who had the means to turn fantasies into reality. The jets here weren't just luxurious. They were symbols of power, wealth, and status. Only a handful of people in the world could afford them. Richard stopped in front of the first jet, a sleek, dark silver beauty with hand-stitched Italian leather interiors. With an exaggerated wave of his hand, he introduced it like a magician, revealing a grand illusion. "This is the Falcon 900, he said, his tone dripping with forced enthusiasm. "One of the finest private jets available today. It features cutting-edge avionics, a top-tier entertainment system, and, of course, the kind of comfort that only true luxury can offer." The man in the cap nodded, his gaze sweeping over the aircraft. He seemed genuinely interested, but his expression remained unreadable. "Looks impressive," he said. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he added, "But this isn't the most exclusive one, is it?" Richard's smile twitched. He fought the urge to roll his eyes. "No," he admitted, his patience thinning. "It isn't." Without another word, he strode to the next aircraft, a Gulfstream G -7500, a magnificent machine worth over $70 million. This time, he turned with an expectant smirk, ready to watch the man's expression change at the mention of the price. "Now, this," Richard said with a touch of smugness, "is the Gulfstream G -7,500. State of the art, everything. Ultra long range, completely customized interiors. And of course, a price tag of $70 million. He let the number hang in the air, waiting for the inevitable reaction shock. Disbelief. Maybe an awkward excuse to leave. But the man simply nodded, completely unfazed. Impressive, he said. But still, this isn't the most exclusive one, is it? Richard's jaw tightened. He narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing the stranger's face, as if trying to uncover the joke. Was this guy serious? A dry, humorless laugh escaped him. You're kidding, right? The man in the cap didn't flinch. Richard had had enough. He was done with the polite act. Stepping closer, he lowered his voice. His words, sharp and clipped. Listen, he said, his patience officially gone. This isn't a game. We don't waste time here catering to tourists. The man didn't move. He simply watched Richard, his expression as calm as ever. Richard scoffed. Do you have any idea what kind of people buy these jets? We're talking about real money, real power, the kind of people who… The man in the cap tilted his head slightly. Are you sure? The words were spoken softly, but they cut through the air like a blade. Richard blinked. What? The man's eyes, sharp and steady, met Richard's with an intensity that sent an unexpected chill down his spine. I asked. The man repeated, his voice calm and measured. If you're sure. A sudden unease settled over Richard. For the first time since this conversation started, he felt something shift, something he couldn't quite define. Before he could respond, footsteps echoed from behind. Firm. Purposeful. Richard turned, expecting to see security. Instead, his blood ran cold. The store manager had arrived, and from the look on his face, something was very, very wrong. The manager, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, walked toward them with quick, decisive steps. His sharp gaze flicked between Richard and the man in the cap. There was a weight to his presence, the kind that instantly silenced a room. Richard straightened his posture, instinctively smoothing his tie. Sir, I… The manager held up a hand, cutting him off. What's going on here? His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second before forcing a confident smile. Everything is under control, sir. I was just informing this gentleman that we only deal with a very specific kind of clientele. The man in the cap said nothing. He simply stood there, watching the exchange unfold with quiet patience. The manager's expression didn't change. And by specific kind of clientele, you mean? Richard felt a bead of sweat forming at his temple. He cleared his throat. Well, as you know, our jets are exclusively for individuals with significant purchasing power. I was just ensuring that we weren't wasting valuable time. A long silence followed. Then, to Richard's horror, the manager let out a short, dry laugh. Wasting time? He repeated, his voice filled with something Richard couldn't quite place. Disbelief? Amusement? Or something far worse? Richard swallowed hard. Two just meant. The manager ignored him completely and turned to the man in the cap. And then, for the first time since entering the showroom, the man's identity was acknowledged. Mr. Reeves, the manager said, his tone shifting into something respectful, almost reverent. It's truly an honor to have you here. Richard's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat as his brain struggled to process what he had just heard. Mr. Reeves? His eyes widened in horror as he turned to get a better look at the man he had just spent the last 15 minutes belittling. The cap, the beard, the calm, unshakable confidence. How had he not recognized him? The man standing before him wasn't some broke nobody. He wasn't a lost tourist wandering into the wrong store. He was Keanu Reeves. The realization hit Richard like a freight train. His legs felt weak, his hands turned clammy, and his throat went dry. He had just humiliated one of the most famous, respected, and if the rumors were true wealthiest actors in Hollywood. Keanu, for his part, simply smiled. A small, knowing smile. One that told Richard, without words, that he had known exactly how this would play out from the very beginning. The manager's expression hardened. I trust you've been treated with the respect you deserve, Mr. Reeves. Keanu let out a quiet chuckle. He didn't answer immediately. Richard's stomach dropped. The manager took a slow breath and turned to him. Richard, he said, his voice calm but firm. Can I have a word with you? In private. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He knew, without a doubt, that his career was about to take a very serious turn for the worse. The air in the showroom felt heavier than before, thick, with a silence that pressed down on Richard like a physical weight. His face had lost all color as he followed the manager toward a private office at the back of the showroom. Every step felt like a countdown to his inevitable downfall. Keanu remained standing in the VIP section, watching them go with the same unreadable expression. Other employees, who had been discreetly observing the situation, exchanged glances. The mood had completely shifted. As the glass office door shut behind them, the manager turned slowly, crossing his arms as he studied Richard with an expression of quiet disappointment. "Do you understand what just happened?" he asked. Richard swallowed hard. His mouth had gone dry. "Sir, The manager raised a hand to stop him. "Don't try to justify yourself. Just answer the question. Do you understand what you just did?" Richard hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "I made a mistake." "A mistake?" The manager let out a humorless chuckle. "You didn't just make a mistake, Richard. You publicly humiliated a valued customer of the most well-respected figures in the industry. And you did it based purely on your assumptions." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but the manager wasn't finished. "Do you have any idea what this could mean for us? Do you know how quickly stories like this spread?" He gestured toward the showroom. "People were watching, employees, customers, and if I'm not mistaken, at least one person was recording the whole thing on their phone." Richard's stomach dropped. He hadn't even noticed. The manager leaned in slightly. "You assumed Keanu Reeves wasn't worth your time. And now we have a PR disaster on our hands. Do you really think he'll want to do business with us after this?" Richard couldn't meet his gaze. The manager exhaled, rubbing his temple. "You've been working here for years, Richard. You know better than this." A long pause. Finally, Richard managed to find his voice. "Sir, I regret what I did. I let my own biases cloud my judgment. But I want to make it right." The manager studied him carefully, considering his words. Then he straightened. "You're not being fired," he said, much to Richard's surprise. Richard blinked. "I'm not?" The manager shook his head. "Number. But you're not staying in your current position either." Richard felt his stomach twist. "Starting immediately, you'll be reassigned to customer service," the manager continued. "You'll be the first point of contact for every single person who walks through those doors. And I don't care if they're wearing a designer suit or a tattered hoodie, you will treat them all with the same level of respect." Richard opened his mouth, then shut it again. He knew better than to argue. "You need to learn," the manager said simply. "And this is the only way." Richard swallowed hard and gave a slow nod. "Understood." The manager held his gaze for a moment longer, then exhaled. "Good. Now go back out there. And when this conversation is over, you'll personally apologize to Mr. Reeves." Richard hesitated. Then, with a stiff nod, he turned and left the office, stepping back into the showroom with a sinking feeling in his chest. Keanu was still there, speaking with the manager about the aircraft. But when Richard approached, the actor turned to him with that same quiet, knowing smile. It was time to face the consequences. Richard felt his pulse hammering as he approached Keanu Reeves. He had dealt with high-profile clients before, but never had he felt this level of humiliation. The weight of his own arrogance pressed down on him like a crushing force. Keanu turned to face him, his expression calm too calm. There was no anger, no gloating, just quiet patience, as if he had already predicted this moment from the start. Richard cleared his throat. His voice felt tight in his throat, but he forced the words out. "Mr. Reeves," he began, struggling to maintain eye contact. Want to sincerely apologize for the way I treated you earlier. I was wrong to judge you based on your appearance, and I deeply regret my behavior." A silence followed. The showroom felt unnaturally still, as if everyone had paused to listen in. Keanu studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I appreciate the apology," he said, his tone even. Richard exhaled, relieved that it was over. But Keanu wasn't done. "You know," Keanu continued, his voice soft but firm, "this isn't the first time something like this has happened to me. It's happened to a lot of people." Richard stiffened. He knew what was coming. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Let me ask you something, Richard. What if I really had been just some regular guy walking in here to admire the jets? What if I had no money at all? Richard swallowed hard. He didn't have an answer. Keanu gave a small, knowing smile. Would that mean I deserved less respect? The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He had spent years believing that wealth was the ultimate measure of worth. But standing in front of Keanu Reeves, a man who had more wealth and fame than most could ever dream of, yet carried himself with complete humility, suddenly felt like the smallest person in the room. Keanu didn't press further. He simply let his words settle, then turned back to the manager. Now, shall we take a look at the most exclusive jet? The manager nodded quickly, eager to move forward. Richard, however, remained frozen, his mind still reeling. As Keanu walked away, Richard watched him go, feeling something unfamiliar stir inside him. It wasn't just regret. It was the realization that, for the first time in a long time, he wanted to be better. The atmosphere in the showroom gradually returned to normal, but the tension lingered. Richard stood frozen for a moment, his mind replaying the conversation with Keanu. He had spent years believing that success was about power, about asserting dominance over those who didn't belong. But now, confronted by someone who had everything yet carried himself with humility, Richard felt his perspective beginning to crack. Keanu and the manager disappeared into the exclusive showroom, where only the rarest and most expensive aircraft were displayed. Richard, now demoted, knew he had no place there. Instead, he turned toward the front of the store, where his new job awaited him. A few employees exchanged glances as he walked past. Some whispered, others smirked. The arrogant Richard the salesman, who once prided himself on knowing who mattered and who didn't, was now nothing more than a glorified greeter. It stung. But as he reached the front desk, a thought struck him. Maybe this wasn't just a punishment. Maybe it was a second chance. Meanwhile, inside the private showroom, Keanu Reeves admired the craftsmanship of a custom-built jet, running his hand lightly along the polished interior. The manager stood beside him, eager to rebuild the company's reputation after what had happened. I want to personally apologize again, Mr. Reeves, the manager said carefully. What happened today was unacceptable, and we're taking immediate action to ensure our staff receives better training. Keanu turned to him with a small, amused smile. No need for the formalities, he said. Honestly, I've been treated worse. The manager chuckled nervously, unsure how to respond. Keanu let out a light sigh, looking around the room before adding, You know, I didn't come here today expecting special treatment. I just wanted to see the planes. He glanced back toward the main showroom. But I guess it turned into a lesson instead. The manager straightened. A lesson? Keanu nodded. For Richard. For your staff. Maybe for a few others too. The manager followed his gaze and spotted Richard at the front desk, speaking to a couple who had just walked in. Unlike before, there was no arrogance in his posture, no forced smile. He was actually listening. Something had changed. Keanu clapped the manager on the back lightly. Looks like it worked. The manager exhaled, relieved. Would you still be interested in discussing a purchase? Keanu chuckled. We'll see. But first, let's take a closer look at that jet. The showroom slowly returned to business as usual, but the shift in energy was undeniable. Employees whispered among themselves about what had happened. Some sneaked glances at Richard, who was now standing at the front desk, assisting customers with none of his usual arrogance. For the first time in his career, he wasn't judging them by their clothes, their shoes, or their perceived wealth. He simply listened. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves continued his private tour with the manager, moving through the exclusive section of the showroom. He admired the craftsmanship of the jets, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in the finer details. The manager, still eager to recover from the earlier disaster, did his best to keep the conversation light and professional, but he couldn't help but notice that Keanu seemed more focused on people than planes. As they neared the end of the tour, the manager hesitated before speaking. Mr. Reeves, if I may ask, will this experience affect your decision to purchase? Keanu smiled, running a hand along the polished interior of the last jet they were viewing. I haven't decided yet, he admitted. Then, with a small chuckle, he added, But I will say this, it's not just the planes that make a company. It's the people. The manager nodded, understanding the weight of those words. As Keanu made his way back toward the exit, he passed by Richard once more. This time, Richard wasn't scrambling to make a sale or prove himself. He was simply doing his job properly. Keanu paused briefly, catching Richard's eye. "No hard feelings," he said with an easy smile. Richard swallowed, still feeling the weight of his earlier mistake. "Thank you," he said awkwardly, "and I'll do better." Keanu gave a small nod, then turned to leave. As he stepped out of the showroom, the air seemed lighter. He hadn't come here to teach a lesson. But sometimes, life had its own way of delivering them. As for Richard, the next few weeks were tough. He had to earn the respect of his colleagues all over again. And the transition from a top salesman to a humble customer service assistant was humbling, to say the least. But he stuck with it, and slowly, over time, the arrogance faded. Because the truth was, Keanu Reeves had given him something far more valuable than money or status. He had given him perspective.